struck her in the jaw. That's what a real threat would do, petty officer. Not this dancing. What are they teaching you in whatever backwater program you crawled out of? The words, laced with the casual cruelty of unchecked authority, echoed across the sun-baked asphalt of the training ground at Coronado. The crowd of sailors and junior officers, assembled for a Joint Command physical readiness demonstration, shuffled their feet. A few nervous snickers broke the tension, quickly stifled. They laughed not out of malice, but out of fear and reflex, the deeply ingrained instinct to align with power. In the center of their circle of judgment stood Petty Officer First Class Maya Rostova. She did not flinch. She did not scowl. Her face, framed by dark hair pulled back into a severe regulation bun, remained a mask of placid neutrality. She simply blinked, a slow, deliberate motion, as if clearing a mote of dust from her eye. Her focus was not on the red-faced captain barking insults, but on her own hands, which she slowly unclenched and then clenched again, not in anger, but in a quiet, rhythmic reset. She was a study in stillness, a pillar of calm in a storm of arrogant noise. Her posture was perfect, a balanced distribution of weight that spoke not of aggression, but of profound readiness. But when the legendary Master Chief Thorne, observing from the shade of a Humvee 100 yards away, saw her stance, the slight, almost imperceptible shift of her hips, the way her lead foot was angled to control the center line, he didn't see weakness. He saw a coiled spring of lethal precision, and a cold dread washed over him. Not for the petty officer, but for the captain who had no idea what kind of god he was mocking. The captain, a man named Evans whose career had been built on immaculate paperwork and loud speeches, saw only a small woman, unimposing in her standard-issue fatigues, who seemed to be faltering in a simple hand-to-hand combat drill. He saw what his prejudice wanted him to see, a confirmation of his deeply held belief that the new standards were weakening the Navy, that true warriors looked and acted a certain way. And she was not it. If you believe that true strength is measured in control, not volume, and that competence is the only voice that matters, type silence below. Captain Evans continued his tirade, his voice a bullhorn of condescension that stripped the dignity from the afternoon air. He paced back and forth in front of Rostova, his polished boots crunching on the loose gravel, a stark contrast to the silent placement of her own worn combat boots on the training mat. "Look at this," he bellowed, gesturing to her with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Is this what special warfare is sending us now? Someone who hesitates? Someone who can't even handle a basic simulated engagement with a training partner half her size? In the real world, hesitation gets you killed. It gets your team killed. Do you understand me, petty officer?" Rostova's training partner, a young seaman barely out of A school, looked mortified. He had executed the prescribed move, a telegraphed right hook, and she had performed a perfect parry and slip, a fluid motion that redirected his momentum and left him off balance. It was textbook. It was flawless. But to Evans, it wasn't aggressive enough. It wasn't loud enough. It lacked the theatrical violence he equated with strength. He saw her economy of motion as timidity, her precision as weakness. He was a man who understood force only as a blunt instrument, and he was witnessing a surgeon's scalpel, utterly failing to comprehend its purpose or its power. The sun beat down, reflecting off the polished brass on Evans's uniform, making him a beacon of indignant authority. The onlookers felt the heat, the oppressive weight of the captain's anger, and the profound, uncomfortable silence emanating from the woman at its center. Her silence was not empty. It was dense, a gravity well that seemed to absorb all the noise he threw at it. She stood in what martial artists call a state of zanshin, a lingering awareness, a state of relaxed readiness that persisted before, during, and after the execution of technique. Her breathing was even, almost inaudible, a stark contrast to the captain's huffing and puffing. She was a closed system, a self-contained unit of professional calm. Her eyes, a deep, unreadable brown, were not locked on the captain's angry face. They were slightly defocused, taking in the entire scene, noting the position of the crowd, the shimmering heat rising from the pavement, the location of the Master Chief by the Humvee. Her mind was a tactical computer, processing data with an unnerving lack of emotion. Captain Evans, fueled by the lack of a reaction, grew even more incensed. He interpreted her stillness as disrespect, her silence as insubordination. "I'm speaking to you, petty officer. Have you lost your hearing? Or just your nerve?" He stepped closer, invading her personal space, his shadow falling over her. It was a classic intimidation tactic, one that worked on subordinates who feared the wrath of a superior officer. But Rostova didn't even seem to register the proximity. Her gaze remained distant, her body utterly relaxed. The irony was a chasm deep and wide. Evans was demanding a show of aggression from a woman who had likely seen more real violence in a single deployment than he had in his entire 20-year career. He was critiquing the technique of an operator whose muscle memory was forged in the crucible of life-or-death encounters, not in the sterile environment of a stateside training drill. The assembled sailors could feel the injustice of it. They were not experts in hand-to-hand combat, but they were experts in the subtle language of the military hierarchy. They knew they were witnessing a gross abuse of power, a public dressing down that was unprofessional and deeply personal. They saw a captain using his rank to humiliate someone who could not fight back, not because she was unable, but because she was disciplined. And in that moment, their quiet sympathy began to shift toward the silent woman on the mat. They were beginning to understand that the real demonstration of strength wasn't happening in the captain's loud shouting, but in the petty officer's profound, unshakable self-control. Her silence was becoming a shout louder than any of his insults, a testament to a level of discipline he couldn't begin to comprehend. The disconnect between his perception and her reality was the central, unspoken drama of the scene. He saw a flawed sailor. Master Chief Thorne saw a ghost to the Hindu Kush. Evans saw a hesitant woman. Thorne saw the cold calculation of a Tier 1 asset. The captain was playing checkers, moving his pieces with loud, obvious threats. Petty Officer Rostova, however, was playing a completely different game, a game of three-dimensional chess, and she was already 10 moves ahead, waiting patiently for him to make his final, fatal error in judgment. It was a slow-motion car crash of ego and ignorance, and everyone was bracing for the inevitable impact, an impact that would not be loud and fiery, but quiet, devastating, and absolute. The captain's ego, now a runaway train, demanded a more dramatic conclusion. His public lecture had not elicited the desired effect of a tearful apology or a cowed subordinate. It had been met with a wall of serene indifference, and this infuriated him more than any argument could have. "Fine," he spat, his voice dripping with contempt. "If you can't handle a simple drill, let's see how you handle something with a little more." Realism, he scanned the crowd, his eyes landing on Gunnery Sergeant Rex Wrecker Malone, a Marine Corps martial arts program instructor attached to the base. Malone was a mountain of a man, 6'4", with a neck as thick as a piling and hands that looked like they could crush coconuts. He was known for his intensity, for pushing trainees to their absolute breaking point. He was, in Evans's mind, the perfect tool for this particular job. "Gunny, get on the mat." Malone, who had been watching the exchange with a practiced stoicism, nodded once and began to remove his cover. He was a professional, and an order was an order, but a flicker of something, discomfort, perhaps even pity, crossed his face as he looked at Rostova. He outweighed her by 100 pounds of solid muscle. This wasn't a training exercise. It was a public execution sanctioned by captain's wounded pride. "The scenario is simple," Evans announced to the hushed crowd. "The gunny is a hostile combatant, unarmed. Your objective, petty officer, is to neutralize the threat. No dancing, no hosetashin. Full contact. Is that clear?" A murmur went through the assembled sailors. Full contact against Wrecker Malone. It was a ludicrously unfair matchup, designed for one purpose, to break her. Rostova finally moved. She turned her head slightly, her eyes meeting Malone's for the first time. There was no fear in her gaze. There was no anger. There was only a calm, analytical assessment. She gave him a short, almost imperceptible nod. It was not a gesture of submission, but of acknowledgement. It said, "I see you. We are both professionals. Let us do the job." She then turned her focus inward, beginning a subtle preparation that was invisible to the captain but glaringly obvious to the Master Chief. Her shoulders rolled back, a minute adjustment that aligned her spine. Her fingers, which had been relaxed, now curled slightly, ready to grip. Her breathing, already controlled, deepened almost imperceptibly, oxygenating her muscles for the explosive effort to come. She settled into her stance, sinking her weight just a fraction of an inch, rooting herself to the mat. The narrator would later describe it not as preparing for a fight, but as a master craftsman picking up their tools. There was a reverence in her movements, a deep and abiding respect for the violence she was capable of, and a profound discipline in its application. A breath, not for courage but for oxygen. A glance, not for weakness but for angles. A shift, not for escape, but for position. Each micro-movement was a sentence in a language of lethal efficiency that Captain Evans could not read. He saw only a woman standing still, and he smirked, convinced of his imminent victory. He had set the stage for her ultimate humiliation, never once considering that he had actually just set the stage for his own. The silence on the training ground was now absolute, thick with anticipation and dread. The only sound was the distant cry of gulls and the low hum of the bass. Wrecker Malone took his position opposite her, the sheer physical disparity between them a stark, brutal fact. He was a wall of force. She was a whisper of potential. The captain, satisfied, folded his arms across his chest. "Proceed, Gunny," he commanded, his voice booming with finality. The gunnery sergeant did not waste time. He was a Marine, and the order was to engage. He moved forward, not with a wild charge, but with the measured, predatory gait of an experienced fighter. He was testing her, watching her reactions, his massive frame closing the distance with deceptive speed. He feinted with his left hand, a quick jab meant to draw her attention, while his right hand coiled back, ready to deliver a powerful, stunning blow, the very strike to the jaw the captain had so loudly demanded. The crowd held its collective breath. This was it, the moment of impact, the moment of failure. But the impact never came. As Malone's right hand shot forward, a blur of muscle and intent, Rostova moved. It wasn't a retreat. It wasn't a block. It was something else entirely. She flowed. In the instant his fist began its journey, she took a small, lateral step, pivoting on the ball of her back foot. It was a movement of inches, but it changed the entire geometry of the confrontation. His punch, aimed at where her head had been, now sliced through empty air, its momentum carrying him forward and slightly off balance. In that same fluid motion, her left hand came up, not to strike but to guide. Her open palm made contact with the back of his triceps, not with force, but with a firm, insistent pressure. She wasn't stopping his momentum. She was redirecting it, accelerating it, using his own power to fuel his downfall. The entire sequence took less than a second. To the untrained eye, it was a confusing blur. To Master Chief Thorne, it was poetry. He saw the principle of kuzushi, the art of unbalancing an opponent, executed with a level of mastery he had rarely witnessed outside the highest echelons of the special operations world. Malone, a formidable fighter in his own right, was suddenly a passenger in his own body. His forward momentum, now amplified and redirected by Rostova, pulled him past her. As he stumbled, tried to regain his footing, she completed her pivot. Her body was now behind his, in a position of absolute control. Before the big Marine could even begin to process what had happened, her right arm snaked around his thick neck, her bicep pressing against one carotid artery, the blade of her forearm against the other. Her left hand came up to lock onto her own bicep, cinching the hold tight. It was a perfect rear-naked choke, applied with the speed and precision of a striking viper. There was no struggle. There was no grunting, no desperate thrashing. Malone, caught completely by surprise, had time for a single, sharp intake of breath before the world began to go dark. He knew the technique instantly. He knew its finality. He had a brief moment to appreciate the sheer, terrifying efficiency of it before he tapped his hand frantically on her arm, the universal signal of submission. Rostova held the choke for a fraction of a second longer, ensuring the signal was acknowledged, and then released him as quickly and smoothly as she had applied it. Wrecker Malone, the human wrecking ball, crumpled to the mat, not unconscious, but utterly defeated, gasping for air, his face a mixture of shock and a strange, newfound respect. The fight, if it could even be called that, was over. It had lasted perhaps 3 seconds. A deafening silence fell over the training ground, a vacuum of sound so profound it felt like a physical pressure. The snickers were gone. The nervous energy was gone. All that remained was a stunned, collective awe. Rostova simply stepped back, her breathing unchanged, her expression as placid as it had been before the engagement. She stood over the defeated Marine, not in triumph, but in the same state of calm readiness. Captain Evans's jaw was literally agape. His face, which had been flushed with anger, was now pale with disbelief. His mind struggled to process the scene before him. The tiny, unimposing woman, the giant, defeated Marine, the impossible speed, the silent, effortless victory. No, he whispered, the single word a flimsy defense against the tidal wave of reality that was crashing down upon him. That's not possible. Into this tableau of stunned silence, a new figure moved. Master Chief Petty Officer Thorne pushed himself off the hood of the Humvee and began to walk toward the training mat. He moved with a deliberate, unhurried pace, his presence radiating an aura of quiet authority that immediately drew every eye. The crowd of sailors, almost unconsciously, parted for him, creating a clear path. He was a living legend in the naval special warfare community, a man whose quiet reputation was built on decades of service in the world's most dangerous places. His face was a roadmap of hard-won experience, and his eyes held the weight of things seen and done. When he walked, people listened without him ever having to raise his voice. He ignored the gasping Marine on the mat and the dumbfounded captain. His focus was entirely on a young ensign standing near the edge of the crowd, the one holding the clipboard with the daily training roster. Thorne walked directly to him, his gaze unwavering. The ensign, flustered, snapped to attention and offered the clipboard. Thorne took it without a word. He flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning the names until he found the one he was looking for. He stared at the paper for a long moment, the silence stretching out, each second amplifying the tension. Then, he looked up, his gaze sweeping over the assembled personnel before finally landing, with the force of a physical blow, on Captain Evans. His voice, when he finally spoke, was not loud. It was a low, gravelly rumble, the sound of stones grinding together, yet it carried across the training ground with absolute clarity. "Captain," he began, the single word dripping with a cold, controlled fury. "You have a question? You asked what backwater program Petty Officer Rostova crawled out of. I believe I have the answer for you right here." He held up the clipboard. "Name, Rostova Maya. Petty Officer First Class." He paused, letting the simple fact hang in the air. Then he continued, his voice dropping even lower, each word a carefully placed hammer blow. "Unit, Naval Special Warfare Development Group." A wave of shock rippled through the crowd. Not SEAL Team 2 or 4. Not even a regular SEAL team. DevGru, the elite of the elite. The unit popularly known as SEAL Team 6. The quiet professionals who existed in the shadows, the tip of the spear, the direct action arm of the Joint Special Operations Command. They were myths whispered about in barracks and mess halls, and one of them was standing right here on this training mat, being publicly berated by a surface warfare captain who clearly had no idea who or what he was dealing with. The blood drained completely from Captain Evans's face. He looked from a Master Chief to Rostova, his eyes wide with a dawning, sickening horror. The world he thought he understood, a world of clear hierarchies and predictable outcomes, was dissolving before his very eyes. He had not just made a mistake, He had committed a sacrilege. He had stood on hallowed ground and desecrated it with his ignorance. Master Chief Thorne wasn't finished. He continued to read from the clipboard, his voice a relentless litany of accomplishment that systematically dismantled every one of Captain Evans's ignorant assumptions. Combat deployments. 7. He let that number sink in. 7 tours in the most hostile environments on the planet. Awards, he continued, his eyes still locked on the captain, include the Silver Star, another collective gasp from the sailors. The Silver Star, the third highest military combat decoration, awarded for gallantry in action against an enemy of the United States. It was an award that spoke of unbelievable courage under fire. Also awarded, Thorne's voice was like iron, 2 Bronze Stars with V device for valor, a Purple Heart, a Joint Service Commendation Medal, a Combat Action Ribbon. The list, Captain, goes on for another page. He let the clipboard drop to his side. Her mission classifications are, of course, redacted. Her specific skill sets are redacted. Her operational history is redacted. Because professionals like Petty Officer Rostova don't put their accomplishments on a billboard. They prove them. In silence. In the dark. A long, long way from here, he took a slow, deliberate step toward Rostova, who had remained at parade rest, her expression unchanged throughout the entire revelation. She had not basked in the recitation of her deeds. She had simply stood, a monument to discipline. Thorne stopped directly in front of her. He looked at the small, unassuming woman, and in his eyes, there was a universe of shared understanding and profound respect. He saw not her gender or her size, but the invisible weight of the trident she wore, the emblem of a community forged in suffering and sacrifice. In a gesture that sent a shockwave through the entire command structure present, Master Chief Thorne, a man whose senior officers addressed with deference, snapped to attention and rendered a crisp, perfect salute. Petty Officer Rostova, he said, his voice now imbued with a formal respect that was more damning to Evans than any shout could be. Your professionalism is a credit to the command. As you were, Rostova returned the salute with equal precision. Thank you, Master Chief, she said. It was one of the few times anyone had heard her speak, and her voice was as calm and controlled as the rest of her. Thorne then turned his gaze back to Captain Evans, his expression now one of profound disappointment. Captain, he said, his voice returning to its cold, cutting edge. You made an assumption today. You assumed gender was a measure of strength. You assumed size was a measure of lethality. You assumed silence was a measure of weakness. You were wrong on all counts. What you just witnessed from Petty Officer Rostova was not a fight. It was a lesson. It was a masterclass in de-escalation and control. She neutralized a threat, a man who outweighs her by 100 pounds, without causing a single lasting injury. She used minimum necessary force. That is not weakness, Captain. That is the standard to which we all should aspire. She is the standard. He let the words hang in the hot, still air, an epitaph for a captain's arrogance. The story of what happened on the training ground that afternoon spread through the naval base like a wildfire in a dry canyon. It started with the stunned sailors who had witnessed it firsthand, their hushed, awestruck retellings echoing through the mess halls and barracks that evening. The narrative took on a life of its own, transforming from a simple event into a modern legend, a piece of institutional folklore. In one version, told over beers at the enlisted club, Rostova had not even touched the big Marine. He had simply collapsed from the sheer force of her presence. In another, whispered between junior officers in the wardroom, Master Chief Thorne had stripped the captain of his command insignia right there on the asphalt. The details shifted and grew with each telling, but the core truth remained immutable. A quiet professional had, with absolute finality, silenced a loud fool, and the natural order of things, where competence outranked arrogance, had been forcefully restored. The legend became a teaching tool. Senior petty officers would tell it to new recruits to illustrate the concept of the quiet professional drill instructors in the Marine compound, including a humbled and deeply respectful Gunnery Sergeant Malone, used the story to teach their students that the most dangerous opponent is often the one you underestimate. The training mat itself acquired a name, Rostova's mat, it became a point of unofficial significance, a place where recruits were reminded that true strength wasn't about how loudly you could shout, but about how calmly you could perform under pressure. Captain Evans, for his part, underwent a transformation that was as profound as it was painful. The public humiliation was absolute. He was not officially reprimanded. Master Chief Thor knew that the quiet judgment of the enlisted ranks was a far more potent punishment, but his authority was irrevocably fractured. He had lost the one thing a leader cannot afford to lose, the respect of his people. For days, he confined himself to his office, the silence of the room a mocking echo of the silence with which Rostova had defeated him. He reread his own fitness reports, his own list of accomplishments, and for the first time, they felt hollow. His career had been a masterclass in perception management, in looking the part of a leader. He had cultivated the loud voice, the aggressive posture, the unyielding certainty. Now he saw it all for what it was, a fragile shell hiding a deep-seated insecurity. He had mistaken volume for value. He had confused bluster for strength. The realization was a bitter pill. One evening, a week after the incident, he did something that required more courage than any speech he had ever given. He found Petty Officer Rostova in the base's austere 24-hour gym. She was alone, methodically working her way through a series of complex kettlebell movements, her focus absolute. He waited, standing awkwardly at a distance, until she finished her set. She looked up, her expression neutral as always. "Captain," she acknowledged, with no hint of triumph or malice. Evans cleared his throat. "Petty Officer," he began, his voice uncharacteristically quiet. My assessment of your abilities was incorrect. My conduct was unprofessional. I apologize." The apology hung in the air between them, simple, direct, and stripped of all ego. Rostova picked up a towel and wiped the sweat from her brow. She looked at him, her gaze direct and unflinching. "Understood, sir," she said. And that was all. She didn't offer forgiveness, because it wasn't hers to give. She didn't offer absolution. She simply acknowledged his statement, a professional accepting the correction of a flawed report. For her, the event was over a closed file. She had already moved on to the next task, the next mission. Her quiet acceptance, her complete lack of emotional reaction to his apology was, in its own way, the final, most important part of his lesson. He finally understood that for a true professional like her, his opinion, whether good or bad, was ultimately irrelevant. The work was all that mattered. The ripples of that day continued to spread, changing the culture of the base in small but significant ways. Captain Evans became a different kind of leader. The bullhorn was gone, replaced by a man who listened more than he spoke. He started holding open forums with junior enlisted sailors, actively seeking out the opinions of those he had once dismissed. He championed a new initiative to ensure female officers and enlisted personnel were given fair consideration for challenging assignments. He had learned, in the most brutal way possible, that talent and competence came in all forms, and that his own preconceived notions were a barrier to building a truly effective command. He would often tell the story of his own humiliation to new ensigns, framing it as a cautionary tale about the dangers of assumption. "The quietest person in the room is often the one you should be listening to the most," he would say, the memory of Rostova's profound silence forever etched in his mind. The legend of Maya Rostova became a source of quiet inspiration. Female sailors, in particular, saw her as a symbol of what was possible. A photograph, taken by an onlooker in the seconds after the confrontation, mysteriously appeared on the bulletin board in the women's barracks. It showed Rostova standing calmly, with the massive form of Gunnery Sergeant Malone on the mat behind her. There was no caption, but none was needed. The image spoke volumes, a silent testament to the idea that skill, discipline, and inner strength were the great equalizers. Rostova herself remained an enigma. She was seen on base occasionally, a ghost in fatigues, always moving with purpose, always focused on the task at hand. She deflected any attempts to praise her. When a young seaman, the same one who had been her first training partner, approached her and said, "That was the most amazing thing I've ever seen, petty officer." She had simply nodded and replied, "Control your breathing. It will steady your hands." She was a teacher, but her lessons were not delivered in lectures. They were embodied in her every action. Her philosophy was simple. Competence is quiet. Results are loud. Everything else is just noise. The story even reached the highest levels of the Navy. It was said that an admiral, upon hearing the tale, had summoned Master Chief Thorne to his office. "Is it true, Master Chief?" the admiral asked. Thorne, standing at parade rest, simply said, "Sir, what is true is that Petty Officer Rostova conducted herself according to the highest standards of naval special warfare. She met an unprofessional provocation with professional discipline." The admiral leaned back in his chair and smiled. "That's what I thought," he said. "We need more sailors like her, and fewer captains like that." The incident on the training ground had become more than just a moment of personal vindication. It had become a parable, a touchstone for the entire institution, a reminder of its core values. It was a story about the triumph of substance over style, of action over words, and of the profound, unshakable power of quiet, demonstrated competence. A year passed. The world turned, and the currents of military life carried people to new assignments. Captain Evans, now a more thoughtful and respected leader, was transferred to a desk job at the Pentagon, where his hard-won lesson in humility made him a surprisingly effective administrator. Gunnery Sergeant Malone incorporated principles of leverage and momentum into his martial arts curriculum, forever changing the way Marines at Coronado learned to fight. The training mat was still called Rostova's mat, and the story was now a mandatory part of the orientation for all new personnel arriving on base. And Maya Rostova was gone. She had deployed again, disappearing back into the classified world from which she had briefly emerged. Her name was just a file, her existence a rumor. But her legacy remained, a quiet but powerful presence that had fundamentally altered the landscape she left behind. Her actions that day had planted a seed of change, proving that one person, through an act of profound discipline, could challenge and correct the course of an entire institution. The real measure of her victory was not in the single dramatic moment of a takedown, but in the hundreds of small, positive interactions that now happened daily on the base because of the lesson she had taught. It was in the junior officer who now felt confident enough to voice a dissenting opinion to a superior. It was in the male sailor who stood up for a female colleague being dismissed or belittled. It was in the shared understanding that respect had to be earned through action, not demanded by rank. True legacy isn't what you leave behind in a file or on a plaque. It's what continues to move forward in the people you've influenced. It's the standard that endures long after you're gone. Rostova had not sought to become a legend. She had simply done her job with unwavering professionalism. But in doing so, she had created a story that would inspire others to do the same, a story that would be told and retold for years to come, a quiet reminder that the most powerful force in the world is not a fist, but a disciplined mind. Her silence had left a permanent echo. Somewhere in a dusty, war-torn corner of the world, she was likely doing the same thing, moving with quiet efficiency, speaking only when necessary, her competence a shield for those beside her and a terror to her enemies. She would never know the full impact she'd had on that sunny day in Coronado. She didn't need to. For a quiet professional, the successful completion of the mission is the only reward that matters. The work is all. The ultimate lesson of that day transcended the specific individuals involved. It became a powerful metaphor for a timeless truth. In any organization, in any walk of life, there will always be the loud and the quiet. There will be those who mistake volume for authority, who believe that confidence is something you project rather than something you possess. They are the Captain Evanses of the world. Their bluster a thin veneer over a core of insecurity. They demand respect. They posture. They intimidate. And for a time, they may even seem to succeed. But their foundation is built on sand. Then there are the quiet ones, the Rostovas. They are the craftsmen, the masters, the professionals who have invested thousands of hours in honing their skills. Their confidence is not a performance. It is an intrinsic quality born of discipline and repeated success in the face of true adversity. They do not need to announce their worth because their work speaks for them in a voice far more powerful and enduring than any shout. They understand that true power lies not in the ability to compel obedience, but in the ability to inspire excellence. They lead not by decree, but by example. The confrontation on the training mat was merely a stage where this eternal drama played out in miniature. It was the collision of two opposing philosophies, one that values appearance and one that values substance. The outcome was as inevitable as gravity. Substance will always, in the end, outweigh style. Demonstrated competence will always silence empty arrogance. This is the hope and the promise that the story of Maya Rostova leaves behind. It is a reminder that in a world full of noise, the quiet pursuit of excellence is a revolutionary act. It is an affirmation that your true value is not determined by the opinion of the ignorant, but by the undeniable quality of your actions. The legacy of the quiet professional is not written in headlines or carved on monuments. It is written in the success of the missions they complete, in the lives they save, and in the standards they set for those who follow. It is a legacy of silence, a legacy of competence, a legacy of respect earned in the only way it ever can be, through the quiet, consistent, and undeniable proof of the work itself. For more stories where quiet competence triumphs over loud assumption, and where silent discipline defines their worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Stories.